Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. We're going to get started. Today we have Director of Product Marketing or Product Management, Jeff Bronstein. He is going to be talking to us today about different ways of using the cloud and understanding when is a good solution involve the cloud and when is it better to keep a on-premise copy or look to keep both a hybrid cloud solution, and dive into the details that we'll have around cloud and the efficient way to use it. So Jeff?
Great, thank you, Eric. Hi everybody, this is Jeff. Let's look at our agenda here for our talk. Do a little introduction about what we're going to talk about some perceptions of these technologies, the cloud storage and tape for local storage, talk about reliability, security, and speed for the cloud and tape. Also then we'll talk about data growth and redundancy and how you deal with that in both cases. Look at really kind of the bottom line cost, including the total cost of ownership. Then we'll give some recommendations and closing thoughts. We'll open it up for questions, and we'll also do a little demo that applies to what we're talking about. First, let's talk a little bit about kind of where we're going here today. So obviously, cloud is a big thing. People are constantly talking about it. You can do a lot with the cloud. You can store things, you can process things, you can hold data. There's so much capability in the cloud. It's an amazing tool, and everybody's using it. Spectra Logic here, we use the cloud for a lot of different things, from our testing and engineering to our expense reporting system. We're like anybody else. We fully embrace the cloud. So in terms of storage, that must be the best place to store all your data, right? So again, the buzz, the media coverage might have you believe that. Another thing is then therefore local storage must be dead, right? You don't need to store anything locally anymore. Just put it in the cloud, right? Well, Spectra Logic, the maker of long-term secondary storage systems, is having a record year. So clearly that's not true. And many of our customers are reconsidering how they've done the cloud, either the fact that they've put data in the cloud and reconsidered and brought it back, or maybe they've changed how they want to do it or which vendor they've chosen. So there's a lot to be considered. So the question is it better to store data in the cloud or locally? That's what we're going to talk about. When I'm talking today, I'm going to assume, in terms of, the applying things here, data sets of 100 terabytes or larger, and that data, in terms of where you're just deciding to store that 100 terabytes, is mostly infrequently accessed data. We're assuming that your active data that you're using for your organization is on some type of primary or production or whatever you call your main fast storage system. Maybe it's on solid state drives or whatever. That's your active data. Then you've got this less active data, and you could choose to store that somewhere more affordably. Cloud could be an option. Some local secondary storage can be an option. So what do you do? So that's what I'm going to be talking about. If you've got data sets less than 100 terabytes, a lot of this will still definitely apply, but there's other things to keep in mind. And we're going to be focused on tape today, but there's also a lot of great disk secondary storage systems and archive systems, including those made by Spectra Logic. But today we'll be focused on data sets assuming larger than 100 terabytes, and we'll be focused on tape for local storage discussions. So let's talk about perceptions of some technologies, cloud and tape. First of all, as I mentioned, cloud is, the perception of cloud is it's this amazing thing. It's this leading edge technology, and it's easy to say, to think therefore we should do everything there and store everything there. The reality, though, is cloud is a tool just like anything else, and it needs to be used appropriately. It has its pros and cons just like anything else. Tape, similarly, is another technology. It's another tool, but there's a lot of perception that tape is an older technology. But tape is another tool, and it has its own pros and cons. But you must understand for tape that it continues to get faster. It's getting faster at a rate faster than disk storage, than cloud storage. It's increasing in capacity at a faster rate. So we've got disk systems. We just had our latest enterprise drive release, the TS1160. Each tape, small. You've probably seen digital tapes. They're relatively small. That tape holds 20 terabytes now. That's of uncompressed data. If it's compressed data, 50 terabytes. And we can do speeds, starting at uncompressed at 360 plus megabytes per second per tape drive. And we can put 144 tape drives in our larger tape library. So can be incredibly fast. Nothing can compete with the speed of tape. The cost continues to go down. We can store data on tape for less than a penny per gigabyte, and that's not a per month cost. That is the ownership cost. That's the cost to possess that storage. And tape continues to get easier to maintain, easier to use, largely driven by Spectra, the biggest innovator of tape technology. And for those of you who maybe haven't used tape in a while, maybe you've used it for backup, we tend to be moving tape into the areas where customers are using it for archive, for moving their inactive data that does not need to be backed up. So they're putting it on tape to store there, and you don't have to eject the tapes anymore. In fact, most of our archive customers do not. They either just leave it in the tape library, and if they need another copy at another site for protection, then they'll replicate the data across the wire in the background and write it perhaps to another tape library or a disk system at another site for protection. But you only ever really need, in terms of interacting with the tapes, is putting them in the tape library just to be able to increase your capacity. One of our VARs made a joke about, trying to explain to a customer, we'll just bolt the entry-exit port shut, and that way you won't have any concerns. You can treat it just like a black box, just like a disk storage system might be. Tape is a very reliable medium. It's got a shelf life of 30 years, as the last many generations have. And with technologies that Spectra and others have developed, it's an easy upgrade to the new storage generations. Though we say tapes have a 30-year life, that doesn't mean you want to leave your data on one tape for 30 years. Just like, VCRs and DVDs and all those things, time out over time. They no longer are actively used, and the systems to read them eventually go away. For those reasons, you want to continue to move your data to the newer storage technologies. And with the technology Spectra has, you can transparently, automatically, in the background, migrate that data to the newer storage generations while you continue to archive and restore data. Cloud obviously is, kind of touted again as this magical thing that is perfectly reliable. One of our CTO makes a joke, though. Sometimes people wonder, well, what are they storing it on? Where are they actually storing things in the cloud? Is it a cotton candy or what? No, it's the same systems that everybody else uses. It's mostly disk and a little bit of tape. So they have the same issues of reliability as anybody else. So for the not ultimate protection, but for much greater protection, you really need data at multiple sites at the cloud sites in case there was ever a disaster at that one site. You are dependent on your connection to the cloud, obviously, in terms of reliability. So if that connection goes down, you lose access. And then, though the cloud does have guarantees, service level agreements that they'll guarantee 99 point whatever many nines of activity. If your data isn't accessible for some period of time, you really get minimal credit, for that downtime. And it may have cost you more as a business to not have access to that data than you're ever going to get back from the cloud in terms of you getting money back from them. And I'm sure you see it in the news, the cloud does occasionally go down and is inaccessible. Security is another issue to discuss for both technologies. Cloud can be very reliable in terms of security, but the data breaches do occur regularly. You see them in the news. Often it's, oops, a mistake, I had the wrong access, permission set on those particular files or something. And so you end up, even though you're thinking, oh, I can have less IT staff by moving stuff to the cloud, then the IT staff has to spend a lot of time becoming experts on the cloud. So there is still that overhead. Again, not saying don't use it, but it's just something you need to consider. And the files are all still online. They're on disk, so you do need to think about, am I going to be exposed to attack, especially now to ransomware? That's the most common thing that people worry about. And some providers, like Microsoft Azure, will provide, technology to make you safe from ransomware, but then that's an extra copy and you have to pay extra for that service. The beauty of tape is it's always been a great option for protection from attack and ransomware and those types of things. A tape in a tape library is not immediately accessible unless a robot goes and grabs that tape and puts it into a tape drive. And then you can eject tapes from the tape library if you want to for that ultimate protection, that air gap. Put it on a shelf, take it outside of the tape robot library system, and you are completely protected from any kind of attack. And that's no extra charge. Or if you need to buy second copies of tape, again, that's less than a penny per gigabyte to make that second copy. And with technologies like Spectra has, those copies can be made automated and in the background based on policies you set. The speed use of local storage and tape. Obviously, I think it's obvious that local storage is always going to be fastest, right? You're always going to be limited with the cloud to whatever the speed of your connection to the cloud is. Now, some very fast connections are available to the cloud now. A lot of our customers are getting even 10 gigabit connections to the cloud. But local storage can always even beat that. We'll look at a couple numbers in the next slide. What we find though is when customers are moving data to the cloud or to new local storage for the first time, there's the immediate movement of data maybe that's coming from another system. You've got that immediate migration that'll take however long your connection speed is. But then as your new data comes in, the speed is usually okay, right? Moving data to the cloud, kind of on an ongoing basis. That connection is fast enough, most acceptable for customers. The problem with the cloud comes on retrieving data. The speeds may be inadequate, particularly in a disaster. The day-to-day operation of restoring a file, it's not a big deal. You bring your file back from the cloud or a handful of files, your speed of your network is plenty fast. The problem would be when you have a disaster and you need to pull a large bit of data back because you've lost something. That's where the cloud's going to be a problem. Locally, we can go incredibly fast with the speed of local storage systems, particularly tape. And so, that's something you need to keep in mind in terms of where you access the data. So maybe, and we'll talk a bit more about this, maybe you use the cloud, you store data there for protection, but what if you had a local copy that you could access very quickly? Another thing to point out is if you are using tape for disaster protection, and maybe you're replicating to a tape library at another site, or you're making copies of tapes and putting them in a vault, then you can retrieve all those tapes back and immediately get access to all the data on those tapes. We joke at Spectra that nobody will ever beat the bandwidth of a FedEx truck full of tapes. We can, move petabytes of data at once doing that. So the speed there is important. The other thing to consider is if you're using Cloud Vendor A today, and tomorrow you want to use Cloud Vendor B, moving that data from Cloud Vendor A to B is going to be a time-consuming and costly process. Whereas if you have that data locally and you want to move your data to a local provider, then you can just use your local copy. You won't be charged the egress fees from your first cloud vendor, and you may have improved speeds. So here's just some comparisons of different speeds of things. The first is a gigabit Ethernet. So that would be 1 gigabit per second, which works out to about 125 megabytes per second. Now some people even have now 10 gigabit connections to the cloud, so that would be 1,250 megabytes per second. But even that does compare, even 10 gigabits does not compare to what we can do with tape. A single tape drive can do about 360 megabytes a second of data transfer. And like I said, we can put 144 of those into our tape library. So even 3 tape drives is faster than one 10 gigabit connection to the cloud, and we can do many, many more tape drives than that. So you just can't compare the speeds, and you can see how many days it would move how many days it would take to move these different data sets given these different speeds. And it can be quite staggering how long it would take to download half a petabyte of data from the cloud if you had to do that. Another thing to consider is data growth. So obviously everybody on this call I would predict has more data tomorrow than they do today. So its data is always growing depending on the industry, what you do, and so forth. Obviously that's going to be different, but you need to consider that. So as your data grows, you're hoping, right, that technology is going to evolve so that the capacities of these systems increase. Cloud is going to be mostly disk-based. There are some solutions now where cloud providers have tape in the background, but mostly, most of the things that people are aware of in terms of how they work with the cloud, it is disk-based. And, you're kind of seeing disk hit some limitations now. The capacities are going from 12 to 16 to 18 to 20. They're making very small incremental changes now, whereas, years ago, with Moore's law, we were seeing, doublings, just like processors. So cloud is, since it's disk-based, is seeing limited capacity improvement, and therefore cloud storage prices, it's also reflecting, are relatively flat. So the competition, while it was being driven down in price, cloud was being driven down in price earlier. The prices are relatively steady now. Tape has a long roadmap for capacity. We've been doubling in capacity every few years over the tape generations, and we know for the next several generations how we're going to get to the next doublings of capacity. And like I said, we're at, with LTO-8, we're at 12 terabytes of tape, and with TS1160, we're at 20 terabytes of tape. So, and in a few years, we're going to double those numbers again. So, and again, tape is already a lower cost per gigabyte than disk, and it's going to continue at a much faster rate to reduce in cost than disk. Redundancy, I mentioned that a little bit, but just kind of a general philosophy that we talk about at Spectra is protecting your data by having multiple copies of the data at multiple sites, geographically separated. So again, we're talking here about data that's infrequently accessed. You've taken it off of your active primary production storage system. That's probably where you're doing your only backups, right? You're doing your backups on your primary production storage system, either backups or maybe you've got some scheme where you do replication and snapshots. But either way, by taking this inactive data off those primary storage systems, you actually can greatly reduce your backup costs, your backup windows, and that's all great. But now this inactive data is not being backed up, nor should it be, because it's not active, it's not changing. But you still need a way to protect that data. So putting it at one site and having one copy obviously is a recipe for disaster, because if something happens at that site, flood, fire, earthquake, user mistake, whatever it is, ransomware attack, right, you could risk losing that data. So we always encourage people to have 2 copies of data at 2 different geographic sites. And we even discuss what we call genetic diversity. In fact, we wrote a book about it and how it's important for data protection. So, if you're writing data to the cloud, that's in one location, probably on disk. And if you've got another copy on tape, that's another type of storage medium. That gives you some genetic diversity, and that tape library is going to be at another geographic location. So that might actually be a pretty good scheme, right? Let's have one copy in the cloud and one copy locally, potentially on tape. Let's kind of talk about that a little bit more as we get into costs here. So you move your data to the cloud, and your initial costs are basically nothing, right? You've got no capital costs. You just pay your monthly costs, and as your data increases, your monthly costs will increase. The problem, of course, is that if you're a kind of organization that keeps your inactive data for a long time or forever, then you're going to be paying a lot of money, because you're going to pay that every month for the life of the data. Tape has obviously a higher upfront cost, right? You've got a capital cost, you've got to buy the tape robot, you've got to buy the tape drives, the tapes, all that good stuff. But overall, the cost is going to be far lower. It just makes sense, right, when you kind of do the math. And so we're always happy to do those ROI comparisons for our customers and show them that long-term cost. Cloud storage additionally has many additional charges. That obviously depends on who your cloud vendor is, but there's often costs associated with per object. How many commands do you send them? There's costs to retrieve. There's costs if you're using Amazon's Glacier tier. It depends on how much data and how fast you want to retrieve it. All those costs are all variable. It's complex, and it definitely adds up, and often people get surprised by their cloud bills. So if we were able to do a hybrid model, not only would we have that protection, we'd have the 2 copies, genetic diversity, geographic dispersal by having those 2 copies, but we could do this. We could archive to a local tape system and to the cloud, and never retrieve data from the cloud. Always retrieve locally, unless something goes wrong. Unless something goes wrong with whatever. There's a problem with your file locally on the tape, or there's a fire. Whatever happens that you lose your individual file or mini files locally, you've got all those copies up on the cloud to protect you. So, but that way you never get any of those cloud recurring the charges from the cloud, the additional cost to restore the data, and you get your data back a lot faster. So we really believe that hybrid cloud solution is a combination of on-premise and public cloud. It is very powerful. You get the redundancy, you get your fast and free access to the data because you're always accessing it locally, but you get the data protection of having it in the cloud for disaster recovery. Also, you may want to use the cloud for other things besides the disaster and genetic diversity. Maybe you want to put the files up there so that they can be distributed, shared, published. Maybe you want to process them in some way, like in the media, the entertainment industry. They might put them up so that there's now this artificial intelligence technology that can automatically tag the videos, based on what's visible in the screen. And that's a lot of valuable information for those folks. But you can only do that in the cloud. So you've got to get a copy of that video up there, and that might be a way to do that. So you definitely have those benefits of the cloud as well. So we have a solution that really does exactly that, and it's called the Black Pearl Converged Storage System. And what it does is it acts as a gateway to multiple types of storage technologies. So data flows into the Black Pearl. It lands on a temporary disk cache in the Black Pearl box. So it is a physical box, typically a 4U chassis. And then based on the policies you set, you can move it to one or more different types of storage. So one of those storage could be Spectra tape, as you see on the bottom right there. And that's what we've been talking about for the local storage. We also have a power down disk option. This is a very low cost disk option. It's near the cost of tape, but gives you more of the performance like disk. And we can also power it down to extend the life of the drives and to save energy costs, of course. We can also then, though, with policies, make copies to the cloud. Currently, we support Amazon and anything that looks like Amazon, which would include Wasabi, Cloudian, and others. We also support Microsoft Azure. Additionally, you can replicate your data to another Black Pearl. So you have a policy, you might have a policy in your first Black Pearl at site A where you say, make a copy of that data to the Black Pearl at site B. That Black Pearl at the other site where you replicate to could have its own storage behind it. It might have a tape library, it might have a disk storage, or it might go to the cloud, however you want to do that. That gives you that geographic separation that we really stress is important, and also may be a good way to share data across sites. That's something our customers do. I'm going to show you at the end here a little demonstration of moving data into Black Pearl, and we'll see it go to tape, and we'll see it go to the cloud, and see what that looks like so you can get an idea. But that's, again, all inside of Black Pearl and its software, which has a policy-based system that can easily be set up to decide where the data goes and how many copies in each location. And like in the case of tape, you can set up policies to automatically eject if that's what you do want to do, to take them off site or take it, replicate it to another site. So again, parting thoughts, we think it's really important to have a local copy. Cloud storage may be appropriate, but use it correctly. Use it for disaster recovery or cloud-specific needs like sharing, tagging, publishing, so forth. Always keep data at 2 sites for your protection for this, this type of data. And just remember, I always use the analogy of renting or hiring a car. If you just need a car for a little while, then renting or hiring obviously makes sense. But if you're going to drive a car for a long period of time, years, it certainly makes more sense to own the car. It will definitely cost you less. And that's really the same thing with storage. No matter what the cloud costs are, it can always be lower locally because the cloud uses the same technology as everybody else for storing data. So Eric, do we want to pause here for some questions?
Let's go ahead and just go straight into the demo.
Okay, so we'll do a demo and then we'll answer some questions. It'll just be a brief demo. What I'm going to show you is if we go back to our diagram here, I'm going to move data into that Black Pearl. It's going to land on the cache, and then over a period of a couple minutes, we'll see the data flow to Spectra tape and the public cloud. So let's take a look at that. First, I'm going to show you a client that we use to move data to Black Pearl. So Black Pearl, like the cloud, requires something to move data into it. It's essentially just Black Pearl acts as a repository or a bucket of data. In fact, that's the term we use for our containers in Black Pearl is buckets. It does require another piece of software, just like the cloud, to actually move the data, to figure out what you want to move, and then send the commands and send the files. So we're going to use a client that Spectra Logic has developed called the Eon browser. So for anybody that purchases Black Pearl, they get this Eon browser client for free. What it does is it allows you to move files from a local file system or network files over to the Black Pearl. So that's what we're going to look at. If you've ever used an FTP program like FileZilla or something like that, it'll look very similar. So over here on the left side is my local storage. This happens to be my C drive. I'm on Windows, as you can probably tell. I could also access files that are on a network, M drive or server path, however I want to do that. Over here on the right, I'm viewing my Black Pearl. And I have these top-level containers called buckets, and you can see the icon looks like a bucket. And so we have, on this particular Black Pearl, which is in our lab here in Colorado in the United States, we have multiple buckets that can be used to move data into or out of. Now, you might ask, why would you have all these buckets? Why would you just not have one bucket? Or how do you decide when to create these buckets to move your data into? There's really three things that we identify that we set for buckets. The first is we define policy. So every bucket can have a different policy, meaning where does the data go? Does it land on tape? Does it go to disk, cloud, etc.? The other thing is permissions and ownership. So who has access? What users can access the bucket and what type of access do they have? Is it read, write, or whatever? And then finally for tape, for the buckets on tape, we can define whether the bucket has its own tapes and does not share with its tapes with other buckets, or do the buckets span multiple tapes that are shared, and those tapes are shared by other buckets. So basically, we call that bucket isolation. And you can choose all those things for a bucket. So I've got a bucket here. It's called Jeff AWS test and a bunch of numbers, and we're going to move data into that bucket. Now, this bucket has a particular policy. Now I'm going to show you, and by the way, this Eon browser is a standalone application. It runs on Windows, Mac, and Linux. It's actually under the covers. It's written in Java, but you install it in the operating system. Now this Black Pearl also has a web management interface for administration, and that's what I'm going to show you next. So this is the web management interface for that Black Pearl that we're looking at, and you can see I'm on the page where it's showing also all the different buckets. And so the bucket that we're going to be working with is listed right here. It's owned by a user called administrator, and it has a data policy called one copy on tape, one copy Jeff AWS. So it's going to write one copy of the data to a tape and a tape library, and it's going to write one copy to my own personal Amazon account. So anytime you put data in this bucket, it will be written to those two locations. And so we can see that if we go back to the bucket in the Eon browser here, we can see that the other files that I've written earlier are on tape, they're in the cloud, and they're actually also on the Black Pearl cache. Because remember, like I said, data first flows into Black Pearl and lands on its temporary disk cache. So let's go ahead and transfer a couple of files and see this in action. So we'll go over here and we will select these two files, and I'm going to drag and move those over, and we'll see those files move. And if I refresh here, I will see those files are now on the cache, and in the next couple of minutes we'll hopefully see those written to tape into the cloud. While we're waiting for that to happen, let me just show you how more details about this policy. So if I go here to this one copy tape, one copy Jeff AWS, we can look at that here in the list of data policies in the Black Pearl. And here's the account for that. And if I double click on this, I can see what we call the data persistence rules and the data replication rules. So you'll see that it's going to write one copy to tape and write one copy to Amazon. So there it is, and there's the Amazon. Now this Amazon connector is set up here in our replication rules, and I want to show you how we can choose how data is retrieved from the cloud in our settings, and this is important to understand so that you don't get potentially charged fees on retrievals. So if I go to the settings for my Amazon account here in the Black Pearl, here's all my connection information, and you can see that I can choose when to read the data from the cloud. I can choose last resort, I can choose after a tape, or I can choose never. And that's what a lot of our customers do. That way they never get surprised. There's never an accidental restore. If for some reason Black Pearl tries to retrieve the data from tape and whatever reason it can't, then it'll just error out. But it would always go to the tape first. Another situation would be after tape, in which case it'll always try to get the data from tape first, but if it can't, then it'll go to the cloud. But that has some risk associated with it, right? If it can't get the data and you're doing a big restore request, then you could get hit with a big charge for that restore. So a lot of our customers are just choosing never as the restore. So you kind of you can kind of decide how you want to set that. Let's go and see how our data is doing. As you recall, we moved files 7 and 8. We can hit refresh again, see if it's gotten to the targets. And it has. So now we can see that these files are on tape and they're in the cloud, and we can actually go and see them. So remember, we moved files 7 and 8. I can actually right-click on these files and say physical placement. It'll tell me the specific tape that it's on. So the tape has this barcode. So if I ever wanted to eject that to share it with somebody, share that file or whatever, that I could do that. And by the way, we write our tapes in the open LTFS format, which a lot of other vendors use. So anybody that can read LTFS tapes can read our tapes written by Black Pearl. We can also now go to my cloud account and see this as well, though. So here's the S3 management console in Amazon. And if I click refresh, I can see now that file 7 and file 8 have appeared in my Amazon account as well. So we get a nice transfer over to Amazon. And so that was a very easy policy to set. In that bucket, I just set it by using the web management administrative interface of Black Pearl. All that stuff can also be done programmatically via our API on Black Pearl. I can programmatically create a bucket, set a policy. I can create the data policies. I can add the Amazon information. I can do all that programmatically. And of course, I can programmatically send the files. And in fact, this Eon browser is communicating with our Black Pearl via its API interface, which is a RESTful HTTP-based S3-like interface. And I think I'm done with my demonstration now, Eric.
Awesome. We've got a couple questions that have come in, so we'll go ahead and answer those now. So the first one we have is what tiers of Amazon or what different services of Amazon does Black Pearl integrate with?
That's a great question. So the short answer is all of them. We can do a lot of cool stuff in terms of archiving to Glacier and to all the tiers, and we can restore the data from all the tiers. So if I go back to our interface here, where we look at the connection, I can't remember, and forgive me if I can't remember. Oh, I think it's on the other page, so let me just go back one. So if we go back to this data replication rule here, I think you can actually set where it initially lands. Like, does it initially go to Glacier or what? Oops, sorry. Set that, go to edit. So yeah, you can say initial data placement. Which of the tiers do you want it to go to? So we support all of them, including Glacier. And then we can also restore. So you might have Black Pearl archive it to the standard tier, but then within Amazon, on the Amazon bucket, you might set a policy that says, after 30 days, tier it to Glacier, and that's fine by us. We can still get it back from Glacier. So obviously it's going to take a lot longer from Glacier, but we absolutely support it. The great thing about us having sort of an asynchronous system, because tape also doesn't come back immediately, right, because it's got to load into the tape drive, the tape does, and that's a very asynchronous process. Glacier is exactly the same, so we handle that extremely well. Great question.
Another one that we have is people hear about egress charges. Is that the same as a download charge?
Yes, yeah, egress and download are exactly the same. And there are some vendors that charge for that and some that don't. So it just depends on who your vendor is and how they charge for that. But they'll usually get the money from you one way or another. But yes, those are the same.
And then here's another one. Can Black Pearl notify you when a restore is done from Amazon?
Let's see. Yes, I believe you can register to receive a notification. Yeah, absolutely. And there's a couple ways you can do it. I think you can do it in the web management interface, registering to receive notifications, and then regular notifications. And then there's also an API command where you can register a web endpoint and say, I want this URL to be hit, when a restore is completed. Yes.
And then does Black Pearl support transfer to and from the Backblaze B2 cloud storage?
It does not currently. We've discussed it with them. We think they have a great product. It would be something they would have to help us add, and as we see market demand, we'll continue to consider that.
We got, looks like 2 more coming in. Which backup applications support Black Pearl?
Let's see. So usually what would happen is that backup would be separate from Black Pearl. So most of the I dare say all of the major backup applications support our tape and our disk storage directly without the Black Pearl. So you can have the backup applications write to tape, you can have them write to disk directly. Disk being NAS in our case, right? So without Black Pearl, our disk becomes NAS. And so you would be able to do that. Now, another really good question, because what a lot of our customers are doing that buy Black Pearl, and in fact I dare say a majority of them, will buy a Black Pearl, buy a tape library, and then they will do what's called partition the tape library. So they'll use half of the tape library or some percentage of the tape library with the Black Pearl to move their inactive data. Because again, Black Pearl is really focused more on use of storing of inactive or archived data. So that half the tape library could be used for that. Then the other partition in the tape library could be used to for the backup software, and the backup software could write those backups directly to the tape. And again, that also works for our NAS as well. Great question.
Here's another one. Can you write to both AWS and Azure simultaneously in a migration policy?
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, we've done that. I don't know if we actually have a policy. I can't remember let me go see if our data policies. But yeah, we've tested that and it works great. Let's see if we got the data policy. I think we used to have one called Both Clouds. I was just checking to see if we still have it. Two clouds, there it is. Where is it? Oh yeah. So this data policy. So any bucket that uses this data policy, when you put data into it, it'll write data to Amazon and Microsoft Azure. Yeah, and you could have multiple Azures or multiple Amazons or any combination. Yeah, great question.
All right, last one. Any plans for Azure archive storage?
Yes, it's on our roadmap. We don't have a specific date, but we do have interest in that from customers. When we initially created our integration to the cloud, that storage tier wasn't available, but now we're looking at it as an option, and we absolutely plan to support it, though again, no specific date.
And then would we assume the same for the new Amazon archive Glacier?
Yes, and I think that's a great question. So, yeah, I forget what the name of that. It's called Archive Glacier.
Deep Archive.
Deep Archive, yeah. So I think we would support that now. So we cannot tier immediately. You know, I showed that window earlier where it shows that we can tier immediately to Glacier. We wouldn't be able to do that yet with this new tier, but what you could do in Amazon is you could tier it to the new Deep Archive tier, whatever it's called, and then we could still get it back from that tier because that tier uses the same commands to restore the data as Glacier does. It's called the post object restore command. So if you set up data policies in Amazon to write it to that deeper tier, we can still get the data back. So we support it, I guess, just not as completely as we do the others right now.
Yeah. Perfect. Well, that's all the questions we have. Jeff, thanks for your time. We will have a recording of this webinar that will be sent out to anybody who registered. There is Jeff's contact information. He's brave enough to put that on the screen, so if you have any questions for him, go ahead and reach out directly to him and he can answer that or get you in touch with a Spectra rep who can walk you through any questions, concerns, or issues you might have around the cloud and Spectra products. Thank you, everyone, and have a great day.
Thank you. Bye.